Okay, so another indoor test comparison here. What I have is my Schumacher CAT 2000, and over here is the Schumacher CAT 2000 EC. So the original 2000 has stand-up shocks, the EC has lay-down shocks, and this is another pairing that at some point I would like to run at the Vintage Nationals. Again, they do have two four-wheel drive classes. There's a 13.5 four-wheel drive class that they call Classic four-wheel drive, and then they have a 10.5 four-wheel drive class, which they just call four-wheel drive. So I originally had this one set up long before I got that EC and started building it or restoring it. So this one has the 10.5, even though it's an earlier model. This one has a 13.5, even though it's a later model, but it's boosted. So they actually have very similar performance in terms of like acceleration and straight line speed. So again, we're going to do like some basic cornering and jumping tests. I did spend a lot of time trying to develop setups for these, again based on single jump with no lander on a flat surface. That usually means having more droop, especially in the back for these older cars, because the motors are closer to the back of the chassis. So it's kind of a rearward weight bias. So just to fill you guys in on the 2000 here, this is a 10.5 with a 22 tooth pinion and a 95 tooth spur gear. So that gives you an 8.63 to 1 ratio. Front oil is low C40 weight. Rear oil is associated 35 weight. These do have the variable piston holes, the original Schumacher variable piston holes. I have two holes for both front and rear. Gray springs up front, red springs in the back. And for the actual holes, the front I used the lower row of holes, again, to get a bit more droop. Middle hole in the tower, middle hole in the arm. And then on the rear, this is the lowest possible hole. You can see right here, lowest hole. Again, trying to get more droop. Inside hole on the arm. And yeah, camber link upper inner hole, so that will give you low camber gain and a lower roll center. And on the rear I have the lower outside hole, so moderate camber gain, higher roll center. Okay, and then on the 2000 EC, just to fill you in on that, 2289, so similar gear ratio, but slightly lower because it's a higher turn motor. 50 degrees static timing, 40 degrees dynamic timing, kicking in at 6,000 RPM. Blue front springs, gray rear springs, 40 weight front oil, 32.5 weight rear oil. I think they're both associated oils. 4-hole pistons in the front, 2-hole in the back. And the EC doesn't have quite as many tuning options for the towers, but I have the lower hole in the front tower, and then the outside hole in the front arm for the lay-down options here. I think you can see that right there. Outside hole, lower hole. And on the rear, again, lower hole on the tower. You only get 2 holes. And then on the arm, that's the, is that the inside hole or the outside hole? I think it just comes with, that's the inside hole on the arm, which should give you a bit more droop. Upper inside, upper hole here on the front tower. So both have relatively low roll centers, especially also at the front. Because the EC has lay-down shocks, it has very sharp steering, so you might want to use the upper inner camber link mounting hole to just kind of slow down the response to the steering, depending on your driving style. So anyway, let's get started. We're going to start with the original CAT 2000. I know this wire is a lot longer than it should be. I'm not stupid, I'm just lazy. Let's see. Okay. And then right here. Alright. So you see there's a lot of weight transfer translating through to the suspension. The front raises and then dives a lot under braking. You can see that very clearly. Okay. Now it's kind of on purpose. Right, I want a nice smooth suspension for this car. And since it's a stand-up shock model compared to the laid-on shock model, you tend to want a bit more forward weight transfer on corner entry to get more steering. So let's do the cornering test here, right? Again, my sort of rule of thumb benchmark is when I'm out at that boundary there by the wood, I want to try to corner a 180 within where that red pole is. So let's see if we can manage that. It's a little wide. Not bad. A little wide. Alright. Let's try jumps. That actually lands okay. Now with this car for a while, I was dealing with a lot of chassis slap at the rear. So you can see where I took off pretty hard. I got more air time, and so then the car kind of slapped the ground a little bit. I think that's more at the front than the rear. Oop, there we go. Because the front's a bit softer. But it's not bad. This is a very drivable car. I like it a lot. Takes off nice and level. Doesn't, usually have any jumping issues. Very smooth. Alright, so now we're going to shut this one off. Oop, come on, turn off. There we go. Okay, now we're going to get the EC. I'm going to try that one out. So, unplug this, move this over, bring this over. Putting the batteries in this is a real pain in the ass, by the way, for any of the CAT 2000s. It's a very tight chassis. And I use saddle packs for most of my vintage four-wheel drive buggies, so I have like a B44 lipo cradle that I cut up on either half with the B44 battery posts and the thumb screws and everything. And putting saddles in here is pretty tight, but I think it gives you more even weight distribution, because the electronics are light. Some people will put like a shorty on one side and the electronics on the other side, but the electronics are, I think, probably lighter than the battery. But I don't know, maybe I guess it balances out with the motor here. But then you have like motor weight on the left rear and then battery weight in the middle right, and I don't know. Not too crazy about that. Okay, anyway, let's get to the EC here. Flip this guy on. Oop. There we go. Alright. Now it is fair to say that when you're running on a basement floor, the type of tire you have will make a difference in how much grip you have and how the car corners, just like any surface. But a basement floor is kind of like a little dusty because it's not, a perfectly clean floor like what you have in your living space. So it can kind of replicate sort of a low grip dirt surface if you use slick tires, for example, which I tend to use for my two-wheel drive cars. It's a pretty good test surface. Alright, so let's see how this does. That is much sharper. Look at that. That's at full lock, okay? So I came out right about there with the EC. With the CAT 2000, I was a little, if you take an imaginary line from that red pole and project it outwards, I was just a little bit over that line. So this is a much sharper cornering car at low speeds. It's like not even close. And this is a lot closer to what I get from my Laser and my Inferno 10E. So later on I'll do another comparison between those two so you can see what they're like. But they're also very sharp cornering cars. Oops. But strangely, on power steering does feel like it pushes a little bit in this car compared to the 2000. Okay, let's try some jumps. So it does drive different, a little different, but it still feels like a CAT. It's very light, very neutral, smooth, I guess. Ooh. That's a little wild. So this one slaps the ground a little bit more than the original 2000. I think I have maybe a bit lower ride height on this one. I have to check. But, not bad. Like, if the chassis slaps the ground, it can be bad. It's only really bad if it forces you to wait for the car to settle before you can get on throttle again. Sometimes you'll find that the chassis can slap the ground and you can still get on the throttle pretty quickly or manipulate the car pretty quickly. You don't have to wait. Other times if it, other times you don't have that luxury. Like with my Associated B44, that was always a problem when the chassis slapped the ground because I think it just didn't have nearly enough droop compared to a car like this. But this looks like it could be a lot of fun on the track. Very sharp cornering, right? But a little bouncy. So maybe, if depending on the track layout, if I really want to get rid of that bouncing a bit more, I could try to, I don't know if I can increase the droop a whole lot because I'm already on sort of the most droopy settings for how the shock is set up. So I might have to unscrew the eyelets a little bit at the shock end to make the shock a little longer, or use more preload, increase the ride height, or just use different springs and oil. I like the spring and oil combination that I have here already though. If I go too stiff on the springs or too thick on the oil, then it gets really bouncy. So the car will hit the ground and it won't slap the chassis, but it'll just bounce because you have too much pack. You want to try to avoid that too. So sometimes chassis slap is just a compromise you have to make. You can see that right there when it landed, the rear end really bounced a bit. So this might take a bit more development work, but the original CAT 2000 is clearly in, I would say, better shape as far as jumping performance goes, and even cornering performance. Again, this has better low-speed cornering, but as you start to get on the throttle, it feels like it pushes a bit. See that push? As I was coming around this way and I got on the throttle, it really started to push out. So this will take a bit more work. And so as a pair, maybe not the best pair to take right now because the EC is a little bit incomplete from a setup perspective. Better pairs for me would be either of my Yokomo or Kyosho pairs. Right now what I'm considering taking to Vonats for 2021 is all my Kyosho stuff plus the Traxxas Rad 2 because I've already tested the Inferno 10E and the Laser and they feel perfect. And then at some point, maybe the next year I'll do like the Yokomos because I really want to try this and I really want to bring the 93 Works back out there. But we'll see because I'm also working on a Kyosho Laser ZXS Evolution which I'd like to run as well. So later on, I don't have time right now, but later on I'll do a few more tests with some of the Yokomos and the Kyoshos, and I'll show you that. Okay, thanks for watching.